to wrap up this magnificent week, we have our chairman with us who is going to lead the next session. And in introducing our chairman, I want to thank him so much for the quality of leadership that we have here at CCGI. I will tell you, it's not so easy when an organization is in transformation, because they will not always get written documents and strategic plans and all the crossing all the T's and dotting the I's. And it requires a lot of trust and a lot of support. And, you know, Nigel and the board of CCGI have been very, very supportive and generous with their time in ensuring that we can take a lot of risks here at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute to build to where we are today, that we can bring the entire region today like this together. I also want to, before I hand over to Nigel, thank Dr. Farell, because he has been here throughout the week. And that is such an awesome thing, because it's not like Dr. Farell doesn't have other things to do, you know, but we did ask him if he could come for this final panel and help us discuss the way forward. Dr. Farell is also someone who is an excellent support for us here at CCGI, and we really appreciate him. And of course, Professor Bob Garratt. I want to share, because we do have persons here with us who would not have been present for inaugural Governance Week 2020. This many persons would recall would have been at the start of the pandemic. The CCGI was in a place where it needed to rebuild. And so when we reached out to Professor Garratt to ask if he would serve as the opening keynote for Governance Week, we had just had a thought of what we wanted to have in place. We had no money, we had no real resources. We just knew we had a desire to help make a difference. And Professor Garratt has been so generous with his support, his advice, his guidance. He agreed because he liked the idea of what the Institute's vision was in developing a Governance Week for us here in the region. And not only did he serve as our opening keynote for that inaugural Governance Week in 2020, he has been present with us throughout. He has supported the Institute for us to now build our global corporate governance conference, which is held towards the end of the year as well. And it was with great honor and pride that we bestowed on him the title of CCGI's Global Ambassador at our 10th anniversary in November last year. So, you know, he is so integral to the success of the organization at this time. And so we are very happy to have him join us as we plot the way forward for the Institute in terms of our discussions with ESG, sustainability, and building a circular economy. So Nigel, if I may ask, we can ask Dr. Farell to go first, because he would have a lot to share in terms of all that he would have taken notes of from during the week, and then we go to Professor Garratt afterwards. Okay, so
Thank
Nigel,
you very
I
much.
invite you and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kamala, and thank you again for your leadership. This would not have been possible without you. We all know that, and we are very grateful, and we are very thankful that we made the right decision, putting our money where our mouth is to support you. This week has been, I mean, amazing. Amazing in that we looked at this whole concept of the circular economy from participants across the region, from participants from the private sector, the public sector, listed companies, family businesses. And I think everybody was engaged and very interested in next steps. And we are seeing the frameworks coming together in terms of compliance, definitions. We have the latest IFRS standards coming out. so that we are seeing a framework coming together to help us to measure, because I certainly believe that if we don't measure, we won't be able to monitor or to move the needle as is the topic of this last conversation. So with that in mind, I just want to frame that. So before I hand it over to Dr. Farell and Terry, thank you again for your support. And of course, Professor Garratt. Without you as our ambassador, I don't think we'd have made the kinds of connections that we have made in the short space of time. So I want to thank you as well. Terry, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Nigel, for the introduction, and to Kamla. I just want to correct Kamla. I did miss Monday. I did miss the session with the corporate secretaries, but I was here for the rest of it. And let me say, start off by saying, because I don't want to hopefully sort of miss out on some of these points, but I think that the theme for this conference was inspired, quite frankly. It was inspired, and it has turned out to be an inspiring theme for all of the people who participated. And I was quite frankly very pleased, of course, and a bit surprised, I must say, but very pleased at the range of participation which Kamla was able to put together for this conference, with folks from Belize, from Guyana, from Barbados, from Jamaica, from all over. But also, I think for those of us who are a little bit older and longer in the tooth, like Nigel and myself, I thought that it was really wonderful to see a new generation of really talented West Indians coming onto the scene and speaking to these issues in a very thoughtful. They were all very well prepared. They were all very passionate about what they were talking about. And I thought that for me was perhaps the most outstanding and refreshing thing about the week, to see a new generation coming forward, because the truth of the matter is that the issues that they were grappling with during the course of this week are really their issues. It is really, quite frankly, their problem. It is less so my problem. I've just turned 70. So it is less so my problem, but I mean, obviously I'm concerned for my children and my grandchildren, but it is their problem, and they have embraced it, and they've taken it, and they've grasped it, and they're working with it. So I want to say congratulations to Kamla and to the board of CCGI, and to her team, and to the sponsors, of course, to Massey and all of the other sponsors and so on, for really making this a very, very successful, participative week. Let me just see if I could sort of make some points about what I gleaned over the course of the sessions which I attended on most of the days. And of course, we started off with Nandi Mandela, but I will come to that towards the end. The first thing I would say is that it seems to me that our CCGI members and the member companies, those who participated in the conference, and they were across a range of industries. There were people from finance, people from the energy sector, people from the Jamaica Port Authority, from manufacturing, from the services sector, from all sectors. And what I found was that everybody was alive to the issues around climate change and ESG. It is, and the significance of that point, I think, will come when I make some of my other remarks a little bit later on. But everybody, I think, seemed to have understood and grasped that this was, to use Kamla's phrase, a polycrisis that the world is facing. And what do we attribute that to? I quite frankly don't know, but people are clearly aware and alive, and they are with it. They've been thinking about it, and they are struggling with it in, I suppose, in their own personal lives as well as in the lives of their companies. The second thing I would say is that they are all of them were seized of the urgency of the need for action. So that one of the things that came through in all of the presentations, I thought, was that, look, we need to get the move on, that things are happening, yes, but that we need to press forward with the agenda as best as we can. But there's an acknowledgement, and I think that came out very clearly in the session that we had, where the sort of online survey was done. This was this morning, where folks then acknowledged in that survey that was done during the presentation, that there was a lack of data, and there was a lack of, if you put it, there was a lack of knowledge of what things needed to be done to move forward. So I think that was clear. So there is clearly intent. So intentionality is very much there. But in terms of what data and what knowledge that we need to have to be able to measure, for example, what are we measuring and how do we collect that? And I think people were seeing that there was some gaps there. The third point I would make is that the idea of the circular economy and ESG tend to sort of meld into each other, and I think in some respects it also seemed to meld into CSR. Although people, I think, were very clear to say that this is not that the S in ESG is not just simply CSR, but I think that a lot of the conversation sort of transcended all of those, the CSR, ESG, and the circular economy. And I think it was, I think Derek Luckpat's presentation, at least his initial presentation, because he was on a couple of times, really spoke to what the circular economy was about. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on, because the circular economy has some serious implications, which I think we need to understand and we need to kind of grapple with. And I'm not sure that I would say, probably apart from Derek's presentation, which touched on some elements of that, I don't know that we actually got down into the meat of that. But people, I think, seem to understand that there were some challenges around that. The fourth thing I would say is that there seemed and were identified some very encouraging projects and initiatives around a number of things, around energy conservation. So we talked about some of the things that they were doing in their organizations around energy efficiency. There was, and there's activity, I think Mark Loquan was very good in terms of pointing us, for those of us who weren't aware of the Carry Green website, which identifies a number of projects around the region, both Latin America and the Caribbean, which relate to what was happening in the energy sector, in particular around hydrogen, around renewables, and around carbon capture. That really hasn't started as yet, but at least there is intent to do carbon capture and sequestration in respect to the Point Lisa's companies, certainly. So we have projects which are either in train, the solar project. There's a solar project. We talked about solar projects in Jamaica. I think John De Silva from LASCO talked about the fact that they were already using solar, and a number of companies, I think, around the region are already implementing that. Of course, is well implemented in Barbados at a residential level. There's a couple of projects in Trinidad, so that there are some things that are happening. Trinidad has just done a study on wind generation, trying to identify the areas in the country which would be best placed to initiate wind projects. So very encouraging projects that were identified. Some companies were doing little things, and some were big things. The fifth thing I would say is that, though, that we were not clear, I think, in terms of the actual progress that we had made in terms of the R's of the circular economy, in terms of reducing and repairing, recycling, refurbishing, regenerating. I think that we need obviously to have some data around some of those things. And it was, I think, kind of evident that we didn't have, we didn't have a lot of data in respect of those issues. The sixth thing I would say is that the family session was very interesting, very good session, mostly talking about succession and so on. And there it was very clear that the family-owned businesses, in terms of the panels, there's a recognition that family-owned business, which are mostly SMEs, they're mostly small, very small companies, that they ought to be concerned about ESG, but they face some real constraints in respect of doing anything in that space because they are challenged even with basic governance. But clearly there seemed to be an understanding that yes, you know, even small companies, even family-owned companies, even small and medium-sized companies and so on, need to get on the ESG program. The seventh thing I would say is that that there was if there was one sort of basic conclusion was that the key was about fostering awareness and about changing mindsets. The word mindsets came out a lot of times, and I think people understood that there is a kind of a paradigm shift that needs to take place. It was clear from, I think, from the people who participated in the panels that they had already made that shift in their own minds, that they got it, but they recognized that a lot of our fellow citizens around the region need to get it, so there was a need for change in mindsets for us to enable us to be able to get on with implementation. The other thing I would say is that there was tremendous enthusiasm. I think that infused all of the panels. Everybody was excited about wanting to do something, about the need to do something, first of all, and wanting to do something, wanting to have some impact, whether it's in their organizations or their industry or in the wider society. And the last point I would make actually came out of the very last panel with Wendy Kerry and that panel which Anil Maraj led on the fact that our private sector, and it was very interesting listening to John De Silva from LASCO and Wendy from Massey and so on, talking about the kind of perspective that our, and I would take that to all of the private sector companies that we have in Trinidad. I would make bold to say that they share the perspective articulated by Wendy Kerry from Massey and by John De Silva for LASCO, that they all share it, and that is that it's as to use Wendy's words, it's about hearts and healing. It's about our private sector leaders understand that the way in which we need to run private sector businesses in the region going forward has to have a great deal of sensitivity to our people and to the dignity and to the worth and to the value of every single worker, every single customer who comes across, comes into your business. And I think that is significant because, and I've made bold to say it, but let's assume that it is true. I think that is a sea change in terms of how our private sector leaders think about how they should run their businesses and in whose interest they should be running their businesses. So those were the things that I think came true for me in terms of the panels. I thought really excellent. Now, I just want to make some comments here because I think I'm an economist, unfortunately, and therefore it is very hard for me not to be an economist and not to think like an economist. And I just want to say that one of the things is that I think that it's going to be a tough road ahead for us here in the region. The awareness is there, certainly among the private sector leaders who are represented on our panels and so on. The awareness is there, the enthusiasm is there, the desire is there, but I think that the road ahead is still going to be very, very tough. And let me try to explain why I think that that is the case. The first thing is that I think that there is what I would call a certain dissonance or a certain tension that exists at certain levels. There is what has been discovered in other countries is the problem of, on the whole question of climate change, there's this problem of what has been described as psychological distance between the issue of climate change and what people see and feel and experience and are prepared to do. There's a gap that is there. So that people know that things are happening. I mean, we see that in Canada, the wildfires are spreading smoke all over down into the United States and causing problems there. We see that there are, fires in California. We see that there is flooding in Bangladesh. We see that things are happening. But the problem is that a lot of these things, for many of us, are remote. They're not something that we see and feel. And even because these things are on our news all the time, we tend to become almost inured to them. It's just another thing that has happened. And I think that applies even within our own communities, because we've had flooding episodes in Jamaica, we've had flooding episodes in Trinidad, we've had volcanic ash in Barbados, we've had a number of things and so on, but there is still that problem of psychological distance between the individual citizen and the problem of climate change, which makes it sometimes difficult for people to take action, to want to take action on the issue. The second point I would make in that regard is that I think, and I say I'm speaking as an economist, that we have to, I think, appreciate that addressing the issues around sustainability in relation to climate change, that our companies will incur additional cost. And I think that we know that, you see, because what has happened with climate change is that we as a species, as companies, we have been putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we've been putting methane into the atmosphere. In other words, we've been putting effluents into our streams, and that is imposing a cost on society, but that cost is not internal to the firm. That cost is not and has not been on anybody's balance sheet. It has not been in anybody's income statement. It is just put outside there. So that now that we as a species have recognized that there is a cost to what we've been doing for the last 100 years, and that now fixing that problem, climate adaptation and mitigation initiatives come with a cost. We're going to have to spend money as societies to be able to deal with these problems. I think at the last panel, one of the panelists talked about the problem of sargassum. Sargassum is something that is generated by the warming Atlantic Ocean. It is turning up on our shores throughout the Caribbean. No one particular, it is turning up on the shores of our hotel resorts on the south coast of Barbados. Now, what is the hotel or the resort to do? Is that a problem that they can now take onto their balance sheet? It becomes very difficult to do that. But it's got to be dealt with because it's a problem that is affecting not only that particular resort, it's affecting the whole society, it's affecting the whole economy throughout the region. So the issue is, I think that there are costs which we have to deal with, but they can only be dealt with, quite frankly, by government. And I'm going to talk about government in a second. And there are costs which, in terms of achieving sustainability within our organizations, which will require us to expend resources and to incur additional costs. And I think because people may know that at the back of their minds, there is a reluctance. And the third thing I would say is, again, speaking as an economist, is that one of the things that operates in the minds of businesses is that if I act in a particular way that affects my bottom line, let us say I'm a bank and I decide that I will not grant loans to businesses that are polluting, for example, right? Because they don't meet the particular scores I have set up for that. I could then find myself in a situation where my competitor bank down the road has no such policy, and he gets that business, and he gets that revenue, and he gets that profit. And so therefore the fear of revenue loss or profit loss as a result of you doing something that is consistent with sustainability and with climate change mitigation and so on, but your competitor down the road isn't doing it, and therefore reaps the advantage in the short term, is something that is in the mind of businesses. And that's a problem that's very familiar to economists, which is going back to many decades, in terms of how do you deal with a problem where you have these externalities, as we call them, and they're not brought onto the private balance sheet. The problem of what I call dissonance also applies to our governments, because if you look at what happened with Paris, in Paris, for the first time, countries made commitments, but those commitments that they made were non-binding commitments. And so everybody said, yes, well, we need to do these things and so on. But these commitments are non-binding. And then, of course, you have a president like Donald Trump, who turns around when he gets elected, that comes out of the Paris Agreement, which upsets the whole apple cart. The other issue is that our governments around the world, not just here in the Caribbean, have been very slow with legislation and with the regulations. And there has been forward movement and there has been backward movement. In the United States, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States, well, they made some very weird decisions today, but earlier they made some decisions about wetlands in the United States, which the executive said these are environmentally protected wetlands, and the Supreme Court said no, they're not, and that the private sector could do what they want with those wetlands. So you have a step forward with legislation, and then you have, the Supreme Court in the United States going back. And then you have the dilemma for hydrocarbon producers like Trinidad and Guyana. Guyana is in a very interesting position. Guyana has found a lot of oil, and they found it very quickly. And it makes sense for Guyana. I would say it makes a lot of sense for Guyana to produce all of the oil that it can as quickly as it can before the window closes. Now, you could argue that, well, that is inconsistent with the planet and so on, but it makes sense for Guyana to do that. It makes sense for Trinidad and Tobago, and our ministers of energy and our prime ministers have said, yes, it makes sense for us to continue to produce our hydrocarbons for as long as we can, and we will continue exploring for natural gas, we'll continue exploring for oil, and to produce it and to sell it for as long as we can. But that then, it seems then to be a little bit inconsistent, if you like, with the whole issue around climate change. The other issue that we have is around when we come to the question of the circular economy, because the circular economy requires that you do certain things in order to close the loop. To close the loop means that I take the materials that are typically waste products and I recycle them into something new, or I repair them, I refurbish them, I put them back into use, or I create new products out of them, so I close the loop. The issue with that, as those people who have focused on the problem of the circular economy will tell you, that one of the problems with doing that is that in certain cases, the energy that you use in that process of closing that loop actually could contribute to the problem of climate change. In other words, it's costing us more in terms of energy to be able to close that loop, right? And that's a problem that we've got to figure out how to do. And I want to bring that problem back to the context of the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, we are all small island developing states. We generate waste. Everybody has computers. Computers have all kinds of things in them, including hazardous materials, arsenic, and all kinds of things and so on. But each of us individually may not have the capacity to be able to process that and to recycle that at scale. And therefore, this is one of the ways in which I would want to speak to that regional economic integration, and CARICOM is celebrating its 50th anniversary next week. Regional integration is something that may make sense. In other words, collectively as a region, we can think about recycling some of those materials, locating a facility in one place, might be in Guyana or in Trinidad or in Barbados or wherever, that then does that activity for the entire region. So you can get to the scale, you can be able to deal with some of those issues, for example, processing hazardous materials and so on, deal with it in one place and attain some economies of scale. So let me come by way of closing to what I think is what some of the next steps and one of the things that we need to do to be able to move the needle. The first is around sustainability reporting. And very interestingly, just this week, the IFRS put out the standards in respect to sustainability reporting. Their first standards are very preliminary. I had a look at some of them. What I find interesting, and Nandi Mandela in her initial opening ceremony speech and so on, spoke to that question about the reporting and encouraging us to begin that process. And we now have a set of IFRS standards in that space. And if you look at the standards, you will see that what the IFRS has done is that they have given us a number of different standards for different industries. So there are standards for oil and energy, there are standards for financial services, for insurance, and so on. And getting back to the point that was made this morning about measurement, measuring ESG, I think that companies will find it very useful to look at the standards, because out of those standards, you will be able to identify the things that you should measure, and therefore the things that you should begin to start collecting data on to be able to see where you are, right? And we had the presentation this morning with the software and so on. So you have the software to be able to measure and to have your dashboards and so on to see how you're progressing. But the standards, I think, are very timely, and I think it's about disseminating that to all organizations so that they can be able to implement those. The second point I would make is that our corporate and government leaders about leading by example. That is doing those little things, because you see, our leaders are our exemplars. We look at what they do. We look at how they behave. We look at the cars that they drive. We look at how they consume. And when we do that and we see them acting in a particular way that encourages energy conservation, we see them driving and moving to electric vehicles and so on, then that encourages the rest of us, I think. So they can provide leadership to the rest of us by our leaders acting in a particular kind of way that is consistent with where we need to go. Fleet conversions, government requiring, and I think some governments have done so, requiring that you move your entire fleet of government vehicles, remove your entire fleet of public transportation, all of your buses and so on for public transportation, moving those to electricity or well, you can go to natural gas, I suppose, if that makes sense. Your office buildings, in our office buildings, how we conserve energy within our office buildings, and greening the supply chain. So leadership in that way. The third point I would think is our banks and insurance companies. Our insurance companies have a real big challenge ahead of them. And that has to do with the fact that everything is pointing to more flooding, bigger storms, therefore more damage, therefore higher cost. The reinsurers, because our insurance companies in this region have to reinsure for property. They don't reinsure a lot for motor vehicles, but even that, in the context of some of the kinds of risks which we see emerging with the flooding and so on, they may have to consider actually getting reinsurance cover for even things like motor vehicles and so on. But property is big. We have to reinsure property in the region. The cost of reinsurance has been going up and continues to go up. And we may well face a situation in this region in the not too distant future where the reinsurers may well say, we will prefer not to insure the Caribbean at all because the frequency of hurricanes is too high. What was a 1 in 100-year storm now becomes a 1 in 5 storm. I used to get category 1s and category 2s. Now I'm getting a category 5s, and therefore there's with associated damage. And so therefore our insurance companies here have a real challenge going forward. Citizens are going to have a challenge because our insurance costs are going to be going up. And in addition to that, our insurance companies are probably going to ask us to pay more in terms of the co-insurance factor for the risk that we face. Banks too are going to have to look very carefully at what they do. We already talked about the question of what kind of lending criteria they should be using and how that leans into the question of their profitability. And the last point number 4, has to do with government. And my point simply is that nothing that we do in the private sector is going to make a huge difference unless and until government policy is articulated in ways which support that. In other words, I am suggesting that the real movement of the needle has to be done by government policy. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that, number one, how do you overcome the problem of psychological distance, for example, right? Well, one of the ways in which you do that is that, for example, the government mandating certain kinds of behaviors, government making it expensive for you to do certain things. The government has within its power, not just simply to share out LED or 4 LED bulbs to every residential consumer, but it has the power to ban the importation of incandescent bulbs and fluorescent bulbs. It can do that. It can mandate that everybody uses LED. It can increase the cost of electricity, particularly in places like Trinidad, where electricity is extremely cheap. I'm not talking about Jamaica and Barbados and other islands where electricity is already very expensive. We can tax fuel. In certain Caribbean countries like St. Lucia, for example, there is a tax on fuel for cars. In places like Trinidad, fuel is subsidized, but the whole public transportation system has to be made conformant with sustainability and what we're doing with climate change. And the best way to do that is for the government to subsidize certain things like electric vehicles and tax other things like the internal combustion engine. So it simply makes it expensive. You influence people's behavior and people's choices by appropriate tax policies, by appropriate subsidies in certain kinds of places. And you can do that in respect of encouraging businesses to adopt certain kind of policies. The ones that you want to encourage, you will subsidize, or you can lower the tax for those things. And the things that you want to discourage, you can increase the taxation for those things. And government can move on things like digitalization, which I think some of them are doing. And as I said, the scope for recycling at the regional level as an idea, as a potential project, is something which I think it's only the governments could in fact initiate something like that. So with that, Kamala, and I know I've gone much too long, let me stop there and invite any comments, and of course, Professor Garratt's comments on what I may have said.
Thank you very much, Terry. I think you're spot on. The next step, of course, is to get very specific. But let's hear from Professor Garratt before we get into the conversation. Professor Garratt.
Right. First of all, thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Dr. Farell. A personal note at the beginning. May I thank all my friends in CCGI for the astonishing number of people who contacted me on the loss of my dear wife, Sally. And that was really most moving. And I thank all of you for that. Right. I know that we have fairly limited time, and I know we have a lot of other questions and answers, judging by what's coming up on the screen. So I will not give the little speech I was going to give. What I will do is respond in my way to what Dr. Farell has said, in the hope that this moves the argument on. And I'll do that by talking mainly about mindset change, not about the technical detail of the circular economy. I'll junk that. And I'll do that by talking, first of all, about a little case study. Way back in the 70s, I was a teacher running a postgraduate student research group, and we were asked to go into the city of Toul, which is in central France, to study a problem that was occurring in the community there. The community was falling to pieces. The city was said to be falling to pieces. It was the poorest place in France. Everybody hated it. The officials were all trying to leave. They were depopulating the city, moving the population out to the countryside. And they were talking about pulling down the medieval center of this very lovely city, but very decrepit city. So we took a small group of students in on a pro bono project and just started looking at what was actually there. We were horrified to hear that the town was thinking effectively of abandoning the place. This really reflects on what Dr. Farell was saying about the use of data, because the first thing we had to do was find out whether the population of the central city had actually disappeared, and whether it was now full of immigrants who the locals didn't like. And that took a little time. And this was achieved by the students who were rejected by everybody in the city at the beginning. The students sat at a cafe at the bottom of big flight of steps leading up to the cathedral, because they had worked out that that's where many of the old people lived. And the old people had enormous difficulty lugging their goods and their shopping up to where they lived. So the students offered free service just to walk with them, to take their goods up. And as they walked with them, they started talking about who lived where and how it worked, and what services they had. And after a couple of weeks, the local people decided, actually, these students weren't as awful as they looked. And also, most particularly, weren't tax people from Paris, which they suspected they were spies. And the confidence began to build quite rapidly. And as it built, the old people began to say, come into our houses, have a look round, see what you see. That's exactly what happened. We started then surveying every single house, every building, every apartment in the whole of the center of the city. And for the first time, the local authority actually had details on who was living there and what the quality of their buildings were. And that data was totally contrary to anything they had believed up until now. And that was interesting in itself. Also, they said the place, remember, this was just before Portugal joined the EU, and they were saying the place was full of Portuguese immigrants who littered the whole of the center of the city and were a damn nuisance. We pointed out that there were less than 9% Portuguese immigrants in the center. But the reason it looked as though there were more was because every evening they would sit out in the sun. All the families would come out and sit together. So it looked as though there were lots and lots of them. There were very few. So that was another piece of data. And as we began to put this together, that was the end of really our first 3-month session. We were worried that we would leave them alone, and over the winter they would slump back into their old ways, and their mindsets would revert to the idea of pulling the city down. So we were desperate to find some sort of symbol, some sort of way a mindset could be changed rapidly. And in the end, we found a woman in the center of the city who was willing to let us chip the ghastly grey cement render that was on the buildings all over the center of the city, made everything look grey. And she was willing on her house alone to let us chip, because we thought behind it there might be beautiful, half-timbered, medieval house. And there was. And as soon as people saw that, they said, oh, well, perhaps we have the same behind ours. For 200 years, we haven't seen these, but it's worth a look. So we left them like that. And then the second year we came back and we were then able to do pilot projects. So from the data we collected in the first year, we were able to build ways in which we could demonstrate not just the beauty of the houses, but the fact that some of them were incredibly well built. I mean, some of the medieval houses had 3 or 4 meter thick walls, so they were cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And all they really needed was new electricity, new water, and new gas or new energy sources. So we worked on that. And to cut a long story short, at the end of all that, we were able to talk to them about the idea of creating what was then called a stable state economy. That if they began to trade amongst themselves, rather than import a lot of goods from other parts of France and other parts of the world, they were a very agricultural community. If they could bring in their own stuff and trade it amongst themselves, then you could begin to create a much more stable economy. And that worked pretty well until the bureaucrats in Paris decided that was almost certainly breaking every type of procurement law there was, and they tried to stop it. They never effectively stopped the whole thing, but they did. Now, my thinking was stable state economy is interesting, but obviously it has limitations. And I was interested in, could we develop this not in a stable state? Because if you talk of circular economies, then if you go around in a circle, you come back to the place you started from. You actually have a true revolution, but it doesn't get you very far. So I started thinking about, if we have a revolution, can that revolution go up one level? So it becomes more a spiral economy rather than a circular economy, that we actually look for very careful growth. And this led into then the fields of ecology and such like, and and talking with my medical friends, the idea that growth for its own sake is really only seen in nature, in cancer. And that was a bit of a shock to me. So how do we develop effective, healthy, useful growth, not, if you like, what became in our terms shareholder value type growth, which became all about greed and fairly cancerous financial activities. So I then started looking at how we develop innovation, creativity, and such like, and from that into renewability and sustainability in those areas. And the whole notion then of ecosystems and how governance is a key part of supporting a stable system, but within a growth activity. And that paradox is still with me and still remains there. So the notion of spiral then became more helical. So if we look at DNA structures, what are the 2 strands that are growing upwards to allow us to have that growth and living, sustainability in the genomes? And that moved on again then, lots of paradigm shifts then occurring. Really to the point at the moment where I'm looking at a simple axiom. And that axiom is that enterprise plus environmental impact plus social impact equals effective corporate governance. And that notion of how we generate creativity, innovation to take us forward, but in a healthy way, it's giving us a new way of looking at enterprise, and how that then can be combined with the impact we have on our physical environment, and how that in parallel can be combined with the impact we have on our social environment. All that can be brought together under the heading of effective corporate governance. And that's where I am at the moment. And that I think will be my time limit. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. The thing that comes to mind for me, and I go back to what Terry said, this whole thing about psychological distance and the fact that so as I told you all today, I had my NFM AGM, and of course we have been talking about ESG and the focus on not only the shareholder but the employee and the community and sustainability. And some of my shareholders were quite angry because I was not focused on profits. So I said, well, my job is to feed the Caribbean. And he said, no, your job is to make money, to be profitable. And Terry also alluded to the role of government and policy. And for me, it's policy and politics. Because governments have to be elected to implement policy so that we, heaven forbid, don't get people like Trump back into power. So we have a job, one, to educate and make the connection between what needs to be done and saving the planet. And I alluded to it, I think on Tuesday and on Sunday, to John Doerr's book on Speed and Scale, where he had been very clear that this is the goal, net zero by 2050. I don't know if that will be enough, but net zero by 2050, and we should be halfway there by 2030. And then he goes into very, very specific objectives by sector that I think is worth paying attention to. So electrifying transportation, decarbonizing the grid, fixing food, protecting nature, cleaning up industry. The question for me is, and I'm opening up here, anybody can jump in. Where do we start? How do we get Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica or the Caribbean as a whole, because this is where we are, to understand this is how many gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent we are putting into the atmosphere every year. And Massey, this is your piece. Nigel Romano, this is your piece. And to get to net zero by 2050, here are some of the things you can do. And for me, the important thing for the government involvement is government needs to really educate and fire up the conversation so that people understand that we are playing with our children and our grandchildren's lives. And therefore, this is why we are going to increase the price of electricity. This is why we are going to increase the price of gas vehicles. We are going to impose to those externalities, Terry, taxes on this kind of behavior. And here is why, and this is why you should vote for us if that's the case, if you know what I mean. So for me, that's the challenge. That's the getting that psychological distance, shortening that psychological distance. So the more influential among us understand why we need to go down this path. And I suppose we need to get the psychologists involved and whoever else, but for me, that's the challenge.
Well, you have a notion there of the future. So one of the big mindset changes is that we have to think about the future and not the immediate present and the very short term. And in doing that, the mindset is we are holding the ecology in stewardship for the future. And that's a very different change around a boardroom table.
True, but again, we need to get people on board. And as Terry said, in a competitive situation, when X decides to do what is not in the interest of the future or the environment, X should be penalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like what Nigel shared just now in terms of being able to really quantify what the problem is, and then be able to share that among all the stakeholders and say, so this is your portion, this is your portion. And I think that is a very, very good next action step. The challenge is, how do we pull that information together? Because that is the quality of data that can really help us to move things forward in a very structured way towards getting the kind of new outcomes that we want.
But let me just say, I mean, I just take Trinidad and Tobago as an example. Trinidad is a very high emitter of CO2, but it is almost entirely because of Point Lisas. Point has ammonia and methanol plants, which is just simply put CO2 into the atmosphere. And so therefore, that's not something that each citizen has to take responsibility for. When we do emissions on a per capita basis, Trinidad and Tobago looks high because we are taking, but so really, how do you deal with a problem like Point Lisas? It can only be dealt with by government, for example, mandating carbon capture and sequestration from the Point Lisas companies. So they are supposed to take the CO2 that they are emitting, take it out. Now, fortunately for us, and Krishna Prasad has been saying this for a long time, because he has always been arguing about enhanced oil recovery for Trinidad, using CO2 to re-inject into particularly the fields that we have on land, and some of it may be needed offshore in the shallow fields, where we need to get the gas and get the oil moving, to inject the CO2 into those fields. And he's been saying that for a long time. So here we have something that, number one, benefits the planet, because you eliminate that and you put the CO2 into the ground and it doesn't come out, it's sequestered. And at the same time, you get some oil or some natural gas out of it.
Right. And so may I ask if we can consider not necessarily that there must be legislation, Dr. Farell, although of course that would help, but we have to really move towards that level of maturity where we can do some self-policing, where we can have activism, where we can bring that level of awareness to the estate, where we can talk about actively monitoring and sharing that information and bringing that kind of moral suasion into the picture to have these companies do something. Because sometimes they can, but they choose not to because there's no real pressure to move in that direction.
Well, I mean, I don't. I mean, I think you need legislation, of course, and as long as you know, legislation can't cover everything. So that's why you still need to have people voluntarily doing certain kinds of things. But all of the majors, BP, Shell, all of them have said, listen, we have a responsibility to the planet. Now, BP, for example, has made some significant announcement 2 years ago. They are pivoting, they said, away from fossil fuels, and they are moving into renewables, and that's where the incremental investment is going to be going. I believe them so far. I think that, I mean, they've gotten a windfall in the last couple of years because of the Ukraine war and so on, which the UK government, by the way, has not taxed. They have not put a windfall tax on those companies. But I believe BP in particular, Shell less, I'm not so sure about Shell, but that they are pivoting and that they are investing incrementally in renewables, as they go forward, and that they will come out of fossil fuels eventually.
And Nigel, if I may, I just want to ask our audience if there's anyone who would want to add anything. You could simply raise your hands, or and put on your videos so we could identify, and we would. So Derek, yes, I see you made a point in the chat. Can we just invite you in to be part of the discussion?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Derek.
So, well, there's been so many points that were made. Is there any one in particular? I mean, it's a fantastic discussion. This is one of the very few events I've been to which I wish there was more time.
No, I mean, one of the things, given what you have been doing, are you seeing any focus on the data? So this is the amount of CO2 that we are emitting. Here is our plan. We want to reduce that, and and here are the things we are be doing. So for me, it must be linked to an objective.
Yes.
It cannot be a nice to have. It must be real. So to Terry's point, BP is pivoting, but what is the promise? And by pivoting, we are going to do X, and as a result of X, we are going to see this kind of reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions. That's the kind of conversation we need to get into.
Okay, so I could answer the question to some degree in that the CO2 conversation is one aspect of the issue. In terms of the way we produce, consume, it clearly is creating problems with the environment, with the climate, and we're seeing the impacts on it. And unfortunately, it seems to be affecting disproportionately the lower income classes more than the middle and the higher ones, which is quite ironic. But to your point, yes, so this is a massive problem. And it requires not just an about turn. That can't happen. It's actually a transition. And it has to happen at many, many levels of society. But it needs to be done by putting aside what we already know. I mean, Dr. Farell, I was listening to him and smiling a lot while he was speaking as an economist. I'm not an economist. I did some studying with economics and I did well, but it requires you to put aside what we have all grown up to believe. I've been in a CEO position for many, many years. I've led companies, and the focus was on many things: people, process, efficiency, but the bottom line was the Holy Grail. And so that is something that if you talk in that context, the circular economy does not really make sense. It's going to be very difficult for someone to understand it. So we need to set the stage for the conversation. But to go to your point about data, so how I'm working on a Latin America and Caribbean project, I'm focusing actually in the agro-food section. We have a construction section, we have a plastic section, and we have an agro-food section. We're focusing getting the quality infrastructure, the national standards bodies in the region to understand circular economy. So these are the people who are involved in developing standards, testing, certification, accreditation, because they are fundamental to the building blocks of a new economy. And it's taken a couple of years to get it into the system and get them to understand the fundamentals, because if they are not there moving head and head with the transition that is already starting, because the EU is leading the way as we see, because you're seeing quite a number of things happening, not necessarily in, I would say, the most sensible way, because some of it is political knee-jerk in terms of putting in certain legislation or certain bans. So what we are doing then is trying to connect what they are doing and what the industries are doing with those big metrics of carbon, with effluence, but we're breaking it down from the ground up. So I'll give you one quick example. And I actually had a very good meeting yesterday with a value chain in Jamaica. We had farmers, processors, packaging, exporters, all around one table. And it was the second time we met. And we're now sitting together because the methodology we're using is not to tell them what to do, it's for them to figure it out. So we have in the conversation, we're going over and over, and you started to actually see some sparks. And it was an amazing session. I actually had to run away from this session to go to that session. They started to realize that, oh, okay, you're not here to just give me money to get better yields or to get better planting material or to give me equipment. No. You are here to help in your value chain, your sector. And we had a multinational company there, by the way, born out of the Caribbean at the table too, just to put that in. And it started to connect the dots. It was fantastic. I myself didn't think it would have happened so quickly. And they themselves started to say, okay, well, so together we actually came up with the 2 or 3 areas we're going to focus on that will reduce the amount of waste that is being generated out of that value chain, put it to some use, and bear in mind the impact it's having, not just emissions, but impact on the waterways, on soils, because they do burning and that type of thing. So in that context, we want to then connect that. And if we do that across several value chains, in not just in the country, but across the region, and this is the idea of doing it regionally, so that chains and sectors could work together, which is not easy to do because of general mistrust and discomfort. Even countries don't, I've sat down, around enough tables to see a very odd behavior, but that trust needs to happen, and easier said than done. But the areas we are working on is chipping away at the bottom, at the actual people who are actually doing the stuff, but trying to bring the players together. So
Thank you.
That helps a little bit.
Thank you. Lorenzo.
Yeah, I really like the perspective that Derek brought there. In my view, a significant part of it has to do with an ecosystem play. And how do we get and mobilize more entities inside of an ecosystem? It's pretty hard for any one company to, from a basic standpoint, it's very hard for any one company to be the circular economy, right? For it to be an economy, you then need many entities that participate in the trade and exchange of services and goods and so on, that are well connected, which really fundamentally requires significant collaboration. So I like the fact that, just using that use case Derek just referenced, that you brought different players to the table, focus on a particular issue. And I think that's a very smart approach, because everyone can't do everything. So what does it look like being able to reflect from within your company on what are our areas of focus from a products and services standpoint, reassess the ecosystem to determine if we are creating, capturing and delivering value, how do we build the right relationships beyond the ones that we have today? How do we build the right relationships that minimizes the waste, increases efficiency, but of course, at the end, improves the environmental outcomes and then the financial outcomes. So that mindset for collaborating and going beyond your company is important. That is not so easy because of course, everyone wants to move at their own pace. And the moment you have to wait for other nodes in the equation to connect with you, that takes a slower path. And so my question inside of this really connects back to what Derek said about the Holy Grail, because every business has a P&L to steward, apart from the people and so on, which is very, very important. And I'm personally very people focused, and I'm convinced and convicted that if we see after the people, we could produce the right results. That takes a certain kind of cultural dynamic and a certain kind of leadership. And in today's terms, it takes a certain kind of boldness. But I want to ask from the economic standpoint, and perhaps directed at either Professor Garratt or Dr. Farell, what are the options we have from the financial side? Because in many cases, some businesses will be hard-nosed and will not move. They will not change perspective, and will not shift their perspective simply because at the end of the day, I have an annual returns to report on, or I have quarterly returns to report on, right? So we have financial cycles that are already set. We have, at those points, we have metrics, and there's an expectation from shareholders about what you have to produce. And so the whole conversation on boards to introduce new metrics that are considered to be complementary in the first instance, or replacing. Complementary meaning profits and profitability and revenue and so on is already there. But bringing in the notion of people and other ESG considerations So I'm asking from a financial or economic perspective, what kinds of things can we introduce there to allow those who are already gung-ho on the existing metrics to start considering additional metrics that they add to the equation? And perhaps what we need is new business cases that we can show over time. Hey, like in the case of earlier, we had Lasco Industries, the Lasco Group on, and they described the financial performance after having made certain changes that are in favor of the environment. And so perhaps we need more business cases, but beyond the winning, observable, measurable cases, I'm just teasing out, are there any other things that boards or management executive teams need to be thinking about that will help them in real terms to shift perspective?
I mean,
Go ahead, Terrence.
Not an easy question, I imagine, but I'm throwing
I mean, as I say, I tend to think about these problems as an economist, and my answer is an economic answer. In other words, I wonder if I want a certain kind of behavior, incentivize that behavior. And if I don't want a certain kind of behavior, I will disincentive. I will just make it harder for you to do it. I will tax you. You see. So if I have farmers who are burning, they're doing the kind of agriculture where they burn stuff and so on.
Slash and burn.
I'm going to tax you. If you burn stuff, I am going to tax you. So I need to change your behavior. So there are a couple of ways in which we change behaviors. And if you have a balance sheet, if you have a P&L, then I look at that P&L and I say, how can I get to that P&L to change behavior? The other way of doing it is psychologically. In other words, I get people to, hold on a minute, I should be doing this. But people are not going to be doing something that they perceive to be against their interests. So I could bet you that after Derek has had his meeting with his group around there, that guys are going to go back home and they're going to be saying, how does this affect my business? See, if their answer is, well, I don't think it's going to be so good for my business tomorrow or next week, then they won't move. I can bet you that that's how it's going to be. And this is why we are having such difficulty with moving the needle on climate change, because one of the biggest emitters of things is cows. We know that now. But you go and tell any government that it is going to have to, remove the dairy industry with all of the farmers who are dependent on these cows and so on and so forth, which we know are sources of greenhouse gas emissions, that it becomes an issue. You see what I mean, people? So my view is, as I said again, as an economist, is that you have, as a government, you know where you need to get to, and we don't have time. That's the other thing about there's an urgency about what we need to do to be able to get to net zero by 2050. And we've lost time. The Ukraine war has come along, and all of the G7 governments have completely forgotten about climate change, and they're all focused on Russia and Ukraine. So they're not doing anything, and so and we're going to have to get back to that issue at some point in time. But you see, the point is, I'm saying that we have to, behaviors can change either by, you write incentives or the disincentives to nudge that behavior. If I, for example, let's take the public transportation in the Caribbean, we have all these internal combustion vehicles. As a government, I can say, listen, in 10 years' time, I would like to have 50% or 60% of the vehicles on my roads as EVs or as hybrids. That's my target, because I know that that's what I need to have. Now, how do I do that? Well, I have to people to stop using internal combustion engines. And how do I do that? I just simply make it expensive for you to do it. I'm not telling you don't drive it, because that is unconstitutional. But I'm saying, if you want to drive an internal combustion engine, if you want to import it, the tax on that is going to be 200%. Well, you can import it if you like. But on an EV, I'm not going to tax you on that. It's going to be free of government tax. There will be no value-added tax on an EV. Going to do, they will, I am as economist until I know what they will do. They will start importing EVs and they will stop using internal combustion engines. And that's how you get to your target, you know.
I absolutely agree on the economist side, but there are other ways of approaching this. When I was talking about the French example, inadvertently, the students had actually activated the local population and given them the best data, which they were then able to feed back to the politicians. And this then created an amazing series of debates that went on over many years as to how do we do best in the community. And nowadays, if you look in the newspapers today, in the Financial Times, for example, the explosion that's just occurred in Thames Water PLC is amazing, because here you have a natural monopoly which was taken over something like 30 years ago as a private institution. They, at the time, had a reasonable bottom line. They were creating reasonable profit, but the incoming investors managed to load the organization with so much debt, now possibly 14 billion pounds worth of debt, that they are finding difficulty simply in servicing their debt, which means they're not delivering the public service that they said they would, and they were doing effectively at the beginning. So this has suddenly thrown the whole lot into public debate. And this is where social media begin to take over. So within a week of this becoming an absolute scandal, we've lost one chief executive, one finance director. There are investors now running for cover, saying, oh, we didn't quite realize that when we were taking out such huge amounts of profit, it was actually really coming off debt rather than off any real activity that was going on. And so I think there's another element to this, not an exclusive, but another element, which is the way in which informing the public, educating the public, is becoming a very, very crucial activity for effective corporate governance.
But it goes back to what Terry said earlier. I mean, I'm sorry I missed the last Massey conversation, hearts and healing. So there has to be an element of engaging, as Professor Garratt said, engaging the community in the conversation and not dictating to them. And I know it's urgent, but we have to do both and.
So you have to do both. We are, and I think an exercise of what we've had for this last week, I think is entirely appropriate. How do you roll this out to kinds of groups and so on, so people get that kinds of consciousness, that awareness? That's extremely important. But having done that, I'm still saying that there is going to be a problem of psychological distance.
I agree.
People are aware that there's a problem. For them to personalize that and then do something about it becomes difficult. I have, for example, for myself, that my next car is going to be an EV. I know that, right? I have an internal combustion engine now, but intellectually, I have internalized the thing, and I know my next car is going to be an EV. Now, there's no economic consideration there. EVs are more expensive actually than ICEs. But you know intellectually that you are doing this because it's the right thing to do. But for the man in the street who is importing what we call a foreign use vehicle, I know there's a particular term for that in Jamaica, where you import foreign use cars. What is his choice? What is his option? You know, is he going to go for an expensive EV when he could, in fact, buy a cheaper foreign use?
But you see,
you see, sorry, part of the solution there, and I suppose the technology and the innovation have to help, is to reduce the cost of electric vehicles.
Yes,
and that's been worked on.
That's right.
Professor Garratt, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have not owned a car for 50 years. I don't need one.
Exactly.
I don't need one, but that means that the infrastructure around me which the
That's right.
state has invested through taxes,
Yes.
has actually allowed me, if I want a car, I can have one. But why do I need one? At the end of my
Yes.
street, I have 7 bus routes, 2
Yes.
railway routes, and private taxi services.
And Uber. So you.
No, we don't talk about Uber. Not in this country. They're the devil incarnate. We talk about licensed black taxis, but no. I mean, it's interesting. Most of my neighbours now are giving up their cars
Yes.
because the infrastructure is so good.
Exactly.
But that takes a lot of investment.
Yes.
I know
If I-
Derek wanted to add something. Yeah. Go
I
ahead,
just
Derek.
wanted to respond to a couple of points that Dr. Farell, and it actually ties back to something Lorenzo said, and even all the way back to what Mr. Romano is talking about data. So in no particular order, they call them deportees in Jamaica.
All right.
And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, some of those deportees are hybrids.
Mhm.
Interesting enough. So it's not totally out. I mean, full electric, different story. The issue around dropping things like taxes and disincentives or even bans, I think those things need to be thought out multiple steps ahead. I think those types of things, from my experience, it could be a bit of a misinformed knee-jerk reaction. I'll give you one quick example. I was at the table when, this is when I was in the public sector, and all the different ministries and agencies around the table discussing this ban on expanded styrofoam packaging. And I think I either to take the credit or the blame for the fact that it's not implemented yet, because I asked one simple question. So the ban was the easy part. They were talking about the alternatives. And I asked the question, who here knows the definition of biodegradable? And there was silence. So, and that led, as I had said earlier in the week, so the Bureau of Standards bringing on an expert from ASTM and educating the private sector and the public sector. So at least we know, because at the root of the issue, the focus was on pollution. And it was very clear after we walked through everything that what they were about to do was only going to create a more expensive pollution problem. You were not going to solve the problem, and you actually could potentially make it worse, because some of these alternatives are, according to certain scientific papers, have elements in them that if they get into the water system, could have an environmental impact and impact on human health. So these types of things need to be thought through by bringing the right people together, because I think you made an earlier point about the government needs to lead us and educate us, but they also need to be educated as well. And
Yes, absolutely.
I'm a huge advocate for people, the right people getting around the table.
Yeah.
And there are excellent people in the public sector, but the leadership parts, I think, is where they need some work. And I'm wondering about one of the questions early in the days, is the CCGI involved in the private public sector boards? I don't know. I meant to message Kamala later and ask that question, but not to take up too much time. Last point really is, and I think the perfect people on the panel here, in considering the cost too of how we do business, those costs that are not normally factored, which are outside of normally the borders of the business.
Yeah.
Those need to be brought into the equation now. So I would rather get my raw material from China or somewhere in Asia, as opposed to Grenada or St. Vincent or wherever, because it's cheaper, dollar cheaper. Can someone help us understand the total, or there's a term that's coined that's called true cost accounting, and I'm very interested in actually learning how that can work, because that type of data, and it touches on what Sister Nex was speaking about earlier, being able to quantify that, because we still have to bring it down to value, because we haven't yet evolved beyond understanding more than dollars and cents. So we got to understand that. But it is a valuable metric to now add and really compare apples with apples, because that's not what's happening now.
Yeah.
And one last quick point, please. Dr. Farell said that this is not his problem. According to Ajay this morning, it is this generation's. So Dr. Farell, we need you involved in the solution, please. Thank you.
It's my children and grandchildren's problem. So
Yes.
No, we are engaged. We want to
We are
make sure that
engaged.
even when we are not here, they have some place to continue living.
Yes.
I know Camille wanted to say
Yes.
something, and I want to ask Dr. Vishnu Durga, who has joined us from Guyana. He's been here through a lot of our sessions over the days. So if he wants to join in the conversation and add anything, he can just put on his video. So we'll add him to the virtual panel as well. So Camille, go ahead.
Yes, I had turned on my video to say something, but then as soon as I have something to say, somebody else makes the point. Have all been quite brilliant. And Dr. Farell, I had made some notes, and in your dissertation, because that's what it was,
Yes.
you covered every point. And then Nigel just filled in on anything else. And of course, Prof. Garratt is always brilliant. But there are still, let me just reiterate what you've all been saying. In terms of next steps, I think it starts, well, not starts. All of us have to be engaged because through public education, and that public education will start with all of us who have been here this week and all of us who are knowledgeable talking to other people.
Yes.
Then when we talk to the people who have the power to approve the public education, to get the public education going so that people begin to understand, yes, it is our problem today, and this is how we can help to solve it, then that will help to push the politicians. Because the more of us who are engaged and saying this needs to be done, then that will create a political movement. When we're doing it from the PSOJ, when we're doing it from the Chamber of Commerce, then governments will listen.
Yeah.
So we move from all of us, or in parallel with all of us, government, which was the point I made at the start of the week, because I am very much into this standards, and I hear Derek's point, and I actually agree with both Derek and Nigel that legislation isn't always the way, but you do need to penalize those persons, like the person dumping in the river, the chemicals, and they're doing it over and over. Derek, you are here, you know, Windalco is a problem for us. So we have to begin to penalize those people. We have to get that true cost that you're talking about, because businesses cannot make their product cheaper by taxing the rest of us and harming the rest of us. So in parallel with the public education, we have got to have some legislation, the incentives as well as the penalties, as well as the standards kicking in. And the public sector has to lead. We need the public sector to be told, you have this net zero target. So in Jamaica, we just launched a CSR policy because we were a little behind, and I was involved in the launch. And these were 100, you know, they made all the public sector entities. This was Ministry of Finance who put it on. But I tacked on ESG to say that is good. We've now sorted out the donations, but the next step now is, what are your net zero targets? So within the public sector corporate governance framework, we now have to begin to insist on our public sector saying, this is what I am going to contribute. And it goes back, we have a corporate governance framework, we have our PBMA and lots of regulations. So a lot of good things are happening in governance on the public sector side. So there you say, you have all of us as the public, you have the government, and in between you have the businesses. Businesses, I find, are you have the Lascars, and obviously you have the masses who understand and have been doing the right things without even calling it ESG. But now that they're being trained in their corporate governance sessions about ESG, they are making specific targets like Grace Kennedy is doing, putting it in their annual reports, et cetera, et cetera. But there needs to be a lot more information going out to our business people so that they can then say, all right, in my neck of the woods, this is what I can do. This is not going to cost me a lot to start with. This is low-hanging fruit, and I move from here. But as I said, all these points were already made by all of you, so I'm just reinforcing what you've all been saying.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Chairman, if I could just respond
Please, go ahead.
to what Dr. Farrell said. the group of the stakeholders, they actually are in the cassava value chain in Jamaica. And it did raise issues about what is the economic benefit. But after the conversation and the discussion and a little bit of education, they actually started to say, oh, okay, we need these other people around the table as well. If this is going to work, we can't do it by ourselves. We need, and that is where I was taken aback that, whoa, they got it so quickly. Helped that there were a lot of the key players around the table in the value chain. So I'm hopeful, and I will at some point let you know how the story ends. But it was very positive.
Yeah, and I think if we assume and don't believe the worst, but believe the best, and engage with the various stakeholders, they're obviously going to be concerned about the cost of doing this. But once you set the targets and put the incentives and the penalties in place, then the innovation and the creativity should begin to see how we can deliver. And I think that has to be the approach.
And you wanted to
Dr. Durga, I don't know if he is.
No,
Yes, Kamla.
I hear you.
Just getting ready for the gym, so not camera ready.
Go ahead, but go
But
ahead.
the discussion has been very riveting, especially for where Guyana is at this point in time. Many of the Caribbean conglomerates operate in Guyana, Massey and Semacall, even large entities like Republic Bank. So it is strange that even from them, we don't hear a lot about the need for everything we've spoken about in the past week when operating in Guyana. It sometimes feels as if they see Guyana as the market for their expansion more than as a home where they also reside. And this is just the feeling, right? I've been in this now for 20 years, and it sometimes feels like a national feeling as well. Last evening at the event, I spoke to one of our largest Guyanese conglomerates, and explained to them, about this event and, their absence from events like these. They were both shocked and surprised that this is going on, and they were not aware. So I told them that I'll arrange. And Kamla, their CFO, actually knows you well, so I promised to connect you to him. But we need our local conglomerates, and there's still a handful in Guyana. There are really a handful that really do, maybe 50 million US and above. And even when I'm looking at everything we spoke about in the past week, it seems like to really go all out and initiate a lot of what we've spoken about. We're talking about companies that do revenues of at the minimum $1 million US a year, and I think maybe $5 million US a year gives them sufficient revenue to be able to plug into the various areas. But I think for the medium-sized entities, if we can come up with a range of lower cost initial activities that can add to their bottom line, I think that would be a good starting point. But the week just really highlighted to me how much more work we need to do in Guyana, and how we also, because of the stage that we're in, we really do have to tie sustainability to profitability as well. Because in a country that has gone through so much for the past 50 years and finally seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, going directly to sustainability without actually being able to experience some profitability, it would be good if we can find a way to achieve both. But the attention in this market at the moment is, getting to some level of profitability, some type of being able to stand on our own 2 feet. And I know that even for our own company, we're now pursuing a project with IDB Lab. And what was interesting is everything we spoke about this week, these are the things we had to put in place in our own company to even qualify for the work that we're going to pursue now with IDB Lab. And I don't think many organizations realize as yet that in order to scale, we do need to have a lot of these measures in place. But it's been a real really good experience. I really commend everyone who spoke, everyone who delivered a message, and I look forward to how we can contribute here in Guyana as well. But thank you very much. It's been really enlightening.
Are you going
Thank you.
to tell him we're coming to Guyana, Kamla?
Yes, I did tell Vishnu that we are coming to Guyana in August. We'd have a big dinner, Vishnu, so you'd be hearing from all of us because we do want to collaborate with the organizations in Guyana, the private sector and government as well. So now that Governance Week is wrapping up, next week you're going to hear from me.
Just a very quick point. I mean, I'm no longer on the board of Republic Financial, but you did mention Republic Bank. But I can't speak for Anson McCall or for Massey, but Republic Bank has set aside $200 million to support ESG projects in the private sector around the region, which of course includes Guyana, right? So I don't know whether it has been sufficiently publicized in Guyana or elsewhere, but I'm just saying that it as a probably the largest commercial bank in the region, NCBJ, Republic has made that commitment to this kind of effort.
Excellent.
And that's excellent. And we need more of that to be publicized, because what tends to happen is, like in Guyana, although we have so much foreign exchange coming into the country, it is still very difficult for Guyanese companies to access foreign exchange. And when the Bank of Guyana traces it, it's a lot of the large regional companies using Guyana as a place to pay their bills from for the rest of their Caribbean operations. So those are the stories that hit the headlines versus, the good that can come about as well. So yeah, again, comes back to us needing to really have that wider discussion.
Yep.
Okay, good. So I hate to be the wet blanket, but it is 6:30.
Yes.
And so we do need to wrap up. So Nigel, I will ask you to have final comments from Dr. Farell and Professor Garratt, and then we'll just wrap up. Right. So thank you guys so much.
Okay. I'll give Bob the last word, of course, but just to say, I only want to say that I really found this week to be really very stimulating, interesting, and in particular, I was really delighted to see the number of new young faces. I say young faces coming and presenting eloquently and with tremendous knowledge and so on. I was quite delightful. So I want to again compliment Kamla for finding these folks from all over and bring them to us. So, and I've really enjoyed it myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, I just want to check one thing with Kamla. How are these ideas and this knowledge being diffused by CCGI? What's the action on this?
Right, so we are recording all of the sessions. We are currently working on editing all of the panels, so they're all going to be shared on our YouTube channel so that it's going to be available for anyone who is doing research in these areas. But we do need to take another step. So I'm going to be having discussions with the company that did our opening video to see how we can pull out key elements that may be shared, because not everyone may want to listen to an hour or hour and a half of panel, but there may be 5-minute nuggets throughout which we can snip and which we can share so that we get a lot more information out.
Okay, that's wonderful, because my final point is I've just been asked to do some work with the University of Cambridge, who are setting up a new institute for sustainability and leadership. And they are also looking to do small chunks, nuggets, as well as run programs. So you may well be able to cooperate with them, which would be very exciting. Because to pick up Dr. Farrell's point, these are all very young people who are very excited and they're determined to make sure things happen.
Yes, and we achieve so much because we do collaborate. We share our resources, we bring skills together, and that's how we get things done. So I would be more than happy. And Professor Garratt, you know, you are a master at being able to link us with persons to help strengthen our bonds and our resources.
I should do my best.
So what I would like to do at this point in time is also to thank Kamala for organizing a fantastic week, getting all these people together. For me, what I would like to see is that we now go to the other business organizations, NGOs, government organizations across the region, and start advocating in our collaborative fashion, of course. We can start at home, but we need to also link up with the PSOJ. I don't know what the appropriate organizations are in Guyana, but we need to start getting people together and really advocating and building the excitement, because this is very urgent and very important. So thank you.